This is a response to a couple of videos on U-doubled. One by Professor Anton about wrapping up the magic sandwich. One by Gary, which I just looked at just now, on digital versus analog. If you're watching this on U-doubled, you'll see that it's now possible to make responses to more than one video. Where I thought they could be quite nice to draw strands together, or bring out points of difference that way. So if you're watching it there, then over there somewhere, or maybe over there, I don't know, this will be a response to those two. But also there's little bits of other videos I might want to just refer to. I've made some notes, so I'll just read some of those out and then see where I go from that. I've got written down silly stories, biblical literalism, I'd like to talk about that, the idea of God as opposed to the reality of God, metaphors, I want to talk about them, of course, that's my interest. Oh, why do we need some fucking metaphors? Thriving as opposed to flourishing, as opposed to pain, happiness, those kind of words. The difference between different kinds of religions and danger. And I've made a note of Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God at the end. Not quite sure why I put that down. Okay, but we want a comment section on grey text of the video. Alright, let's have a look at this. I'm just doing this, I can start from biblical literalism, because you were talking about that, Corey, in your video about wrapping up the magic sandwich, and now you find biblical literalism ridiculous. And I think all of it, I think you as well, Gary, said that. I think we're all in agreement about that. It's silly stories. Why would anybody believe in the talking snake? Why would anybody believe that the water into wine story is literally true? All those kind of things. Yeah, I agree with you that. I mean, my particular take on that, which might differ from yours on that, you two, is what the significance of that is. Because for me, one of the reasons why I'm constantly gobsmacked by biblical literalists is that it seems to show such a lack of respect for their own religion and a way of being so easily satisfied. Sorry, I'm walking through mud here and I've got my train, a big mistake. Why would anybody be satisfied with such silly stories? But also that the literal interpretations of those events are so much weaker than metaphorical interpretations. It's such a naff thing to say that Jesus turned water into wine, that miracle. It's such a naff thing to say. It's a conjuring trick, effectively. I mean, even if he did change the molecules over, big deal, it's a conjuring trick. It's much more interesting as a metaphor, a metaphor of some kind of transformation of something, of something easily available becoming something that's processed, something that has less value into something that's more value. There's all kinds of kind of metaphors and analogies you can play out from that transformation, which are far more interesting than as I say, it being a conjuring trick. In fact, I'd say that in many cases it kind of has to be a metaphor, and if it's literal, the metaphor loses its power. I've been trying to think of an example of this on the way down here to this woods, and I can't think of a biblical one, but that kind of medieval process, the alchemical process of trying to turn base metals into gold, the quest for the philosopher's stone of the alchemists, that kind of thing. I mean, that to me is an example of that. Because the alchemists, I guess many of them were really trying to line their pockets and genuinely trying to produce gold and those kind of things. But the point of it, a lot of the point of it, wasn't anything to do with that. It was to do with the idea of transformation, to do with the idea of purifying through the refiner's fire, as it's often put, and through the idea of a significant change, not significant change in this little bit of hokey pokey. And that might be to do with the transformation in consciousness, or what they probably wouldn't say that. They would probably talk about in terms of spirit or soul. But in our terms, it might be to do with the achievement of a different way of thinking, or it might be to do with a different way of being in the world. It's much more interesting as an allegory, as a metaphor, than it is as a real thing. And as I say, if that had ever been achieved, if it had ever been possible, if one of the alchemists had really realised that, then it would just become a kind of industrial process, wouldn't it? There'd be factories all over the place turning lead into gold. Gold would lost its value. Big deal. The metaphor would actually probably cease to be useful if it was ever literally realised. And I think that's the same with a lot of biblical stories too. And including probably the big biblical story of this existence of God thing. God, to the extent that we are able to understand existence, we understand it largely like this, don't we? The existence of the tactile and the tangible and the stuff that's bound in space and time, because that's what we are, and that's fine. That's reality. But keeping insisting that God exists literally, essentially means you're saying God is like a tree, God is like a rock in the water, or all that kind of stuff, or God is, might be something big, but you're still conferring on this mythical being a status that's far less interesting and far less powerful in metaphorical and allegorical terms than not existing. To not exist as God is far more powerful than to exist, which is why I brought up the ontological argument at the beginning, really. The ontological argument of St. Anselm is founded on the idea that God is infinitely great. To be infinitely great and to actually exist is better than to be infinitely great and not exist. And then he takes it from there. But I would stop right there and say, actually, I don't think that's the case. I think being infinitely great and not existing in reality, just existing as an idea, is in many cases, as in the example of God, greater. And I think the same thing would apply to Plantinga's kind of reworking of that using modal logic, or whatever it is. To exist as God, you can't exist in reality. It has to be an idea, it has to be a story, why not? Go for it. Anyhow, that's, I don't know whether there'll be in any agreement with you two over any of that stuff. Do we need fucking metaphors? I'm jumping about here, sorry about that. I think we do need fucking metaphors, and I love fucking metaphors. In fact, I love fucking metaphors which involve fucking. Because I don't think we can think without them. And I think it's a shame sometimes that we say, there's science and then there's the other stuff which is irrelevant. Because the other stuff which is relevant, the stuff of our understanding, how we understand science, is largely through metaphors. So I'm detached to that for all kinds of reasons. I've written right next to that digital versus analog, though, and this is kind of a note to self as well as a response to you, Gary, about how we think and how language works. Because I'm in agreement with you. I think digital understandings are far more powerful in many ways. And in fact, I'd really like to develop a set of understandings, metaphors, but ultimately grounded in a digital metaphors of databases and information, and those kind of things, rather than analog metaphors we tend to use. But digital versus analog is important, I think, and particularly for something like communication. This thing I'm trying with you right now, both of you right now, anybody else who's listening right now, this is using natural language, the language of verbs and nouns and adjectives and all that stuff, and full of confusion. The opportunities for confusion and misinterpretation, and different kinds of interpretation that exist within the language. So it's almost as if this sentence that I'm saying right now, if you could measure it in some way, measure the probability for error in all these words that I'm saying, measure the probabilities in which my words could go in one direction or go in another direction, words in which those possibilities of the direction in which the understandings of my words could go, and watch those possibilities collapse. It's almost as if this is an analog process here. If you mapped it, it would form a wave, wouldn't it? A probability wave, measuring the likelihood by which certain meanings will be responded to and certain others. And that's not digital, that's analog. Whereas something like mathematics is better because it can be digitized. Digital, it can be digital, yeah. So anyway, so I just think it's inherent in the fact that we use this one word after another thing that we're going to be messing about with the confusion of the analog. Anyway, I don't know. Look, it's nice in some ways, in other ways it's got some limitations, doesn't it? Okay, I'm jumping about a bit more. I've got the word thrive written down here, which I think is a response to you again, Gary. Yeah, I prefer to use the word thrive or flourish, just because I don't like the word. I don't like using pain or happiness or unhappiness as currencies, because they're so context dependent, aren't they? Many people put themselves through enormous pain in order to achieve satisfactions at the end, and it is context. But so I try and apply terms like thrive or flourish to recognise the entirety of that narrative and that person's individual relationship to it. It's not great, but I don't know. And I'm still, well, it doesn't, yeah, that's all I've got to say on that really. Sorry, let's see where I am. Talked about that. Metaphors better than literal descriptions. Sometimes they are. Yeah, I think so. Live, flourish. Some religions. All right, you're talking about religions there, Gary. And here I'm prefacing all this by saying that no religion, to my worldview, has either truth in it or the need for truth in it. You know, there's stories. They're just stories, in my opinion. Stories. And like all stories, some of them are good and some of them are not so good, and some of them have been perverted for dangerous effect, or just used for danger, or created for dangerous effect, or after the fact used for dangerous effect. But then again, so have some scientific theories, including Darwin's evolutionary theories. They have been perverted and used for sadistic effect. So, but religion's much more so, for sure. I'm not disputing that for a second. And a lot of religions are just shit, quite frankly. But you know, to be fair, some religions are harmless. Some are like some versions of Buddhism are fairly harmless. Jainism harmless, as far as I can tell. I don't know what that much about it, but there are some versions of religions which seem harmless, so, and are at best seen as delusions. But for me, you know, if I'm just seeing a religion as a set of stories and not as descriptions of the world, not to be taken in any way literally, then I have no real issue with some people adopting those stories and liking them, you know, just as kind of philosophical, a narrative version of philosophy. You know, a lot of people do like that. I like it in some way. So what's the point of that? Oh yeah, well, yeah, I suppose the overall point of that would be to do with, just to return and try and draw the strands together here a little bit. The ontological argument for the existence of God, the idea of religion, and God as a thought, and whether the world would be a better place without the idea of God in it. You know, just imagine everybody's atheist, right? We're all atheists. Everybody in the world is atheists. But the idea of God is in place. We have this idea. We know it's fake. We know it's just a story. But it's this idea of a grand consciousness, a great, an ultimate good, a force of creation. We've got this idea. We know it's not true. It's just an idea. Imagine that universe, and then imagine a universe without that. Which is the better universe? Is it better to have a universe with the idea of God in it, or is it better to have a universe without the idea of that version of God in it? I think it's probably, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing, I think it's probably better to have a universe that's got the idea of God in it as a fiction than an idea of without God in it as a fiction. And of course they're both better than having a universe in it where people actually believe in. It's just ridiculous. Anyway, that's all I've got to say, I think, really. You just have one last check at my notes. One last check. Oh yeah, there's one last thing. This is about religion, which is to do with, I think it was yourself, Gary, you were saying that, because I'd said in my video that some religious traditions do try to leave the flesh behind. You know, they try to recognise that biology is corrupt and that our history is somewhat corrupted. You know, which might come through in myths about original sin, or might be a kind of recasting of the temptations of the flesh as immoral, or those kind of things. But this idea that biology is corrupt and we should all aspire to the condition of the spirit. I mean, what you were saying in response to that is that, you know, religions haven't really done that. They do tend to be very corrupt organisations in and of themselves, and tend, if anything, to foster the continuation of the biology, or not exactly the celebration of it, but an institutionalization of biological functioning. You know, the DNA becomes scripture. You know, it's work together. And there are certainly some instances like that. I mean, there's an organisation in the States, isn't there, the Quiverful organisation, for example, which, you know, suggests that people should have as many children as possible because fecundity is next to godliness or something. It's that kind of idea. But there's plenty of others that don't. I mean, they tend not to last very long for obvious reasons. But there's plenty of religious traditions that have come and gone that have praised chastity I say don't last very long because obviously those people don't have kids, they don't indoctrinate those kids into those religions, so the religions die out. But there are plenty of religious traditions in the past that have tried to escape the fallen flesh, as I said. I'm not necessarily saying that's right, I'm just observing that. In fact, one of the people I cited, and I wrote this quote down, kind of, was St. Augustine, who was a philosopher, theologian from 1,000 years ago, let's say. And he had this great thing because he was living at a time when chastity was rewarded, and the idea was to escape the sins of the flesh. And he himself wrote quite extensively on the aspiration towards the intellect, as he put it. He didn't even talk about it in terms of spirit. He talked about it in terms of the intellect and intelligence, and leaving the corporeal body behind is not really worthwhile. But he also said, and this is his kind of prayer, grant me chastity and continence, Lord, but not yet. Not yet. He knew it was supposed to want chastity. He knew he was supposed to not want to shag everything that moved. But he also enjoyed himself. He was a bit of a lad, you know what I mean? Anyway, I think that'll do for now. This has been a very long video. It's funny actually because I'm walking here, not in the presence of my dog. I thought I'd just go for a walk where I used to walk my dog, because my dog's not with me right now. Anyway, here I am. And nice to see you all.